My laptop screen had been glowing for 14 straight hours. The cursor blinked in the metadata field as I scrolled through thumbnails that should never have existed, images that should have been buried forever on my camera's memory card. Judge Harrington was standing beside a man I didn't recognize, right at the corner of 17th and Grand in South Chicago. Their body language hinted at negotiation. The closeness between them suggested something darker, far more dangerous than a casual conversation. The photo was sharp, professional, everything I had been trained to capture, and the very thing I should have deleted the moment I realized what I had accidentally photographed. I had been following Harrington's death for 3 weeks. On paper, it was ruled a suicide, but anyone who had ever known the man understood that conclusion was nothing more than a clumsy cover. He was too cautious, too consumed by survival to take his own life. I lived alone in a small studio apartment near Damon Station, part bedroom, part makeshift workspace, part patched-together kitchen. The window nook I had once converted into a darkroom during my film days now sat buried under layers of dust since I went digital. The old radiator clattered against the far wall, a rhythmic sound I barely noticed anymore. Outside, the West Side neighborhood was sinking into a silence that only came with the last hours before dawn on a Sunday. The city felt worn out, recovering from its own exhaustion. The cup of coffee on my desk had long gone cold, yet I drank it anyway, too tired to make a new one. The remaining photos were worse. The man beside Harrington was no stranger after all. After countless nights of cross-checking, I discovered his ties to both interstate organized crime and a former federal agent once investigated for concealing evidence. I had verified it, re-verified, cross-referenced through multiple back channels until the fragments formed a picture no one could dismiss as a conspiracy theory. Someone had killed Harrington, and they had made it look like suicide. These images were proof. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. Tom again. For a week he'd been sending warnings. I had brushed off rumors that someone was asking around about a photographer who lingered too often on the West Side. I had assumed it was just territorial rivalry, a colleague irritated by my presence. But as those images kept flashing across my screen, one after another, I began to wonder if ignoring his warnings had been the worst mistake of my life. The coffee cup shattered on the floor as a hand clamped down on my shoulder from behind. I screamed, purely on instinct, but the sound was crushed by pressure against my mouth. The grip wasn't that of a thief. It was precise, trained. This wasn't a robbery. It was something premeditated. "Don't scream again," a voice murmured against my ear, foreign, maybe Italian or Eastern European. I couldn't tell. No noise, no resistance. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, catching his reflection in the glass. A large frame, built from years of discipline, or violence, or both. Under the faint light, I couldn't make out his face, only its dangerous outline. "The photos," he said, voice flat and hollow. "You've seen them, and you will tell no one." My heartbeat thundered until I thought my chest would burst. How did he know? How had he gotten in? The security door downstairs had been broken for weeks, but none of us thought it mattered. The repairman wasn't due until next week, yet someone had found their way in, knew exactly what I'd seen, and he wasn't alone. A chill climbed my spine, not from the cold, but from the realization that, in that single instant, my life had crossed into a new chapter, one no longer under my control. Before we move on, if you're still here with this story, tell us where you're listening from, anywhere in the world. Leave a comment below and let us know how this story reached you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share so you can hear more gripping tales like this one every day. Your single click helps us keep bringing you unpredictable journeys like the one that continues in part 2. He turned me around, and the light from the laptop illuminated my pale, trembling face. For the first time, I saw his eyes dark, deep, frighteningly calm, as if everything had already been calculated long before I realized what I'd stumbled into. He stepped toward the desk, glancing at the images still open on the screen. The shot of Judge Harrington standing beside the unknown man on Grand, their urgent, intimate body language, was no longer my secret alone. His expression barely changed, yet I caught something in his eyes, an instinctive tightening, the reaction of someone confronted with something that should not exist. "You can't keep these," he said, his tone steady like a slow night rain. "The Yakuza know you have them. They're coming, maybe in less than 30 minutes. Panic burned in my throat. How could they know so quickly? I had finished the sequence barely 18 hours ago, sent only a vague text to Tom. He didn't elaborate, just motioned for me to get dressed and take nothing but what I was wearing. I froze, instincts rising. "Why should I trust you?" I asked, my voice shaking but firm. He met my gaze. Because if you don't leave now, the next people who come won't ask questions. They won't talk. They'll erase cleaner than those images you plan to delete. He pulled a small handheld device from his pocket and pressed 2 buttons. I heard the front door lock click shut, and the curtains drew automatically, sealing the apartment in silence like a tomb. My name is Dominic Moretti, he said. That's all you need to know right now. Dominic waited as I grabbed my wine-colored coat from the chair. My fingers trembled so violently I could barely slip my arms through the sleeves. My black sneakers waited by the door. No socks. I shoved my feet in, my heart hammering wildly. Dominic opened the door, scanning the hallway like a man who'd done this hundreds of times. He moved with the precision of someone who knew every blind spot, every camera, every hesitation in the building's systems. We didn't take the elevator. He led me down the back stairwell, the one I'd never used in nearly 6 years of living there. Below, a black car waited, engine idling, headlights off, rear door slightly open. Dominic guided me inside and slid in beside me. The driver never turned around, just shifted gears and pulled away from Grand, as if the escape were nothing more than a midnight drive through Chicago's sleeping veins. Through the window, I saw the faint yellow glow of my apartment receding the 3rd floor where I had lived, worked, breathed, and believed I was still in control. All of it was now behind me. Beside me sat the man I knew only by 2 facts: his name, and that he had just destroyed everything I once called safe. He wasn't the man in the photograph, but he was the reason I was still alive to look at it, and I was beginning to understand that the man in the photo was only the surface of something far deeper. Dominic didn't need to appear in a frame to be the real danger, because he was the one who lived outside of it. The car sped through the empty streets of Chicago like a shadow gliding past a world I once belonged to. I didn't ask Dominic where he was taking me, partly because I still didn't trust him, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Every sound inside the car was absorbed into a thick silence, until the only thing left was my own breathing and the low, steady hum of the engine. Streetlights streaked across the window in blurred trails, like fragments of a fading memory of my former life being erased one flicker at a time. Dominic sat beside me, back straight, shoulders unwavering, eyes fixed ahead like a man long accustomed to steering others through panic. He didn't speak, and it was his silence that frightened me most. We turned onto the highway before I finally found my voice. "Who are you?" Dominic turned his head slightly, his gaze passing over me for a brief second before returning to the road. "The one keeping you from disappearing." The words sounded less like reassurance, and more like a command meant to close my mouth. But I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Who's the man in the photo?" I asked. Dominic didn't respond right away. Then, in that unnervingly calm tone, as if explaining the weather, he said, "His name is Takashi Saito, Yakuza, not low-ranking. One of their cleanup men, the kind who makes things vanish without a trace. If Harrington met with him, it wasn't by chance." My fingers clenched tightly in my lap, cold sweat trickling down my spine. "And you?" I asked, staring at him. "What's your connection to all of this?" Dominic smiled, not with amusement, but with the weary recognition of someone who had predicted the question long before it was asked. "None. But my people were in the area the night Harrington died, and if your photos caught even a glimpse of them, you've just made yourself a problem for 3 different sides. You didn't just capture a dangerous picture, Grace. You captured a web." The car shifted lanes as smoothly as the way he spoke. I leaned my head against the cold glass, staring into the distance where the highway lights faded into what looked like dying stars. I had never felt so small, so powerless. "When do I get to go home?" I asked. Dominic looked at me, as if weighing how much truth I could handle. "When no one's hunting you for those photos. When I'm certain keeping you alive doesn't endanger anyone else. For now, I'm the safest place you have." "For now?" I let out a hollow laugh. "I'm being kidnapped by the man claiming to save me, driven through the night with no luggage, no information, no choice. Your 'for now' sounds a lot like a life sentence." Dominic leaned slightly closer, not touching me but close enough that I could feel the gravity of his presence. "Grace," he said quietly, "if I meant to hurt you, it would have happened back at your apartment, but you're still here, still breathing. Still able to ask questions you're afraid to hear the answers to." "Don't say my name," I snapped, breath uneven. He nodded, neither arguing nor explaining. The car left the highway and entered a narrow forest road swallowed by darkness. No signs, no lights. I didn't know where we were, No phone signal. No people. For a moment I wondered if this was it, if he was about to switch roles from protector to executioner. But then a house appeared after a curve, hidden among tall pines. Modern, yet unpretentious. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dark wood frames, warm amber light spilling softly from within. An older woman opened the door as Dominic stepped onto the porch. She didn't look surprised to see me. She only nodded, as if my arrival had already been written into the night's plan. Dominic spoke to her in Italian. I couldn't understand the words, but her tone was warm and certain. Dominic turned to me. "This is Elena. She'll take care of you for a few days." I froze. There was no way back, no exit, but there was also nothing left to run toward. Elena led me into a room at the far end of the house, everything neat, precise, arranged so deliberately that there was no room for chance. I stood there motionless, unsure if I was a guest, a prisoner, or something suspended in between. Dominic lingered at the doorway, his eyes no longer commanding, but carrying a quiet warning. "Sleep," he said. "We'll talk when the sun's up." Then the door closed, and I found myself standing alone, in a room that wasn't mine, inside a life I never chose. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The bed in that room was spotless, scented faintly of lavender oil, the sheets perfectly pressed, the blanket softer than anything I had ever owned in my apartment. Yet my body remained rigid, turned to one side under the pale yellow glow of the bedside lamp, my eyes refusing to close. Every small sound from the hallway, every whisper of wind against the glass, every creak of the house made me hold my breath, not because I feared one specific thing, but because I feared everything I didn't know. Dominic had saved me, or more accurately, he had taken me. He hadn't hurt me, hadn't tied me up, hadn't locked me in a van or a cold basement, but that didn't make him harmless. No one moved the way he did without carrying danger along with them. He was no stranger to the dark, and I recognized the eyes of someone who had seen blood. I had photographed murder scenes, interviewed survivors of torture, sat across from criminals who smiled while recounting their crimes. Dominic wasn't like them, but he wasn't innocent either. I sat up when the clock struck a little past 6. The house was silent, as though waiting for me to move so it could decide how to react. I stepped quietly out of the room, bare feet on cold wooden floors. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, turning the living room into a fogged pane of glass. The house was beautiful in its stillness, too precise, too deliberate to be random. It wasn't the home of an ordinary mobster, nor the hideout of someone used to running. It was the world of a man accustomed to power without needing to flaunt it. Elena was in the kitchen. She wore a brown wool sweater, her silver hair neatly pinned back, setting a kettle on the stove as if I weren't the first person she had made tea for amid chaos. She looked up and smiled softly. "You're an early riser." I nodded, unsure what to say. She handed me a cup of hot tea. "No one drinks coffee here," she said. "Not because of sleeplessness, but because Dominic believes tea keeps reason longer." I didn't smile. "Where's Dominic?" I asked. She nodded toward the end of the hall. "Study. He's always there in the mornings." I followed her direction, my legs trembling, palms damp despite the warmth of the house. The study door was slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment before knocking lightly. Dominic looked up from a stack of papers. He wore a gray shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, faint scars marking his wrists. His eyes met mine, neither surprised nor impatient. He tilted his head. "Come in." I stepped forward, unsure if it was curiosity, anger, or the need to understand him that moved me. Dominic gestured for me to sit. I didn't. "What is this?" I asked. "A prison? A way station? Or some kind of guarded sanctuary for a suspect?" Dominic leaned back in his chair. "You're here because if you'd stayed in that apartment another 10 minutes, they would have found nothing left but blood. I'm not doing this to control you, but I'm not a saint either. I'm keeping you here to prevent you from becoming a bigger problem." "Bigger for whom?" I shot back, louder than I expected. "For me? Or for the people you call yours?" Dominic didn't flinch. "Grace, I know you think you're the center of this story, but you stumbled into a game that's been in play long before you ever picked up that camera. I'm not trying to capture you, and I'm not letting you go into a world that's already decided you shouldn't exist." "Then what is this?" I demanded. "It's not rescue, and it's not kidnapping. What's between the two?" Dominic looked at me for a long time. The silence between us stripped me bare. Finally, he said, "This is containment. No chains, but no keys either. The space between what's known and what isn't. You're not a hostage, but you know too much. And in this world, knowing too much is its own kind of crime. I didn't answer him. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew that if I opened my mouth then, the words spilling out would no longer belong to reason. They would only be the screams of someone completely unmoored. Dominic didn't demand a response. He simply watched me for a moment, then turned back to the stack of papers on his desk as though our exchange had been just another passing interruption in his day. I left the study, still holding the cup of tea that had long gone cold. Elena met me in the kitchen with a quiet, unjudging look. She didn't ask if I was all right, didn't offer a single cheap word of comfort. She simply handed me a porcelain plate with a slice of toast, a pat of butter, and a small jar of strawberry jam. "Eat," she said, in a tone that made it clear that in this house, the first order of care was to calm the stomach. The chaos inside the mind would have to wait. I sat at the table and murmured a thank you, barely above a breath. We ate in silence. Everything here seemed peaceful, so peaceful it felt staged. I began to wonder whether that calm was meant to hide something far worse. After breakfast, Dominic returned, no longer with the guarded eyes or clipped tone. He spoke plainly. "We're leaving this afternoon." I looked at him, a cold wave spreading through my chest. "Leaving again?" He nodded. "This house is only a technical stop. The place I'm taking you is safer, more isolated." "Where?" I asked. He paused before answering. "A place in Asheville. You'll be safer there, and we can control who comes and goes." "Sounds like a prison," I muttered. Dominic didn't deny it. "But if the choice is between a prison and a grave, I think it's not a hard one." The car departed late in the afternoon. Elena packed what little was mine with frightening efficiency, her movements suggesting this wasn't the first time she had done such a thing. Dominic sat in the front beside the driver. I was in the back again, this time without panic. Only the quiet resignation of someone who had just signed an agreement she'd never been allowed to read. The journey lasted nearly 10 hours, mostly highway. I didn't ask questions, and Dominic didn't offer answers. Only the sound of tires whispering against asphalt and the steady hiss of wind outside the window filled the silence. When the city of Asheville finally appeared through the night, I was struck by its simplicity. No towers, no noise, just small lights flickering along the hillsides and wooden houses scattered among the trees. The car turned onto a narrow road that wound up through the forest. No nameplates, no streetlights, just a black ribbon of asphalt curling between the pines. The house appeared at the end of the road like a secret, not large but unmistakably deliberate. Its front was made entirely of glass, facing a back lawn overtaken by wild grass and a still pond beyond. Warm yellow light spilled softly from within, like an invitation. Dominic opened the door and entered first. I followed not because I trusted him, but because there was nowhere else to go. Inside, the air was naturally warm, as if someone had prepared it for our arrival. Nothing looked unfamiliar, yet nothing felt familiar either. Elena unpacked quickly and led me to a small upstairs room. It had a large window overlooking the trees, a desk with a blank notebook and a fountain pen resting neatly atop it. I stared at the notebook for a long time, neither opening it nor touching it. Something in the way it waited there made me feel like I was being tested. Dominic didn't wish me goodnight. He only gave me one last look before walking down the hall, leaving me alone in a world he had chosen on my behalf. I stood before the glass, watching the distant lights shimmer between the quiet hills. No traffic, no voices, only the thick sound of night and the thought I couldn't shake. This wasn't home, but perhaps, for a while, it would be the place I'd have to live as if I'd never had another choice. I woke up on my first morning in that house without knowing exactly when I had fallen asleep. Maybe it was when the sky beyond the glass turned a pale shade of ash, or when the rhythmic whisper of wind through the forest became a kind of quiet lullaby. I didn't dream, or if I did, the dreams left no trace when I opened my eyes. Everything in the room remained untouched. The chair by the window still angled the same way as the night before, the pen still resting neatly on the first blank page of the notebook. No one had entered. Nothing had changed. And yet, I could feel something subtly shifting. The house was not silent in the way of empty places. It possessed a silence that breathed, as if each wall, each doorframe, each pane of glass was listening alive with the unspoken hum of my thoughts. I went downstairs, where the morning light spilled through the tall windows, melting the interior into the nature outside. Elena stood in the kitchen, gently stirring something fragrant with nutmeg and ginger. She wasn't surprised to see me. She simply turned her head and nodded. "Dominic hasn't returned," she said, as though answering the question that hadn't yet formed in my mind. "He had business in the north. It may be a few days before he's back." I didn't know whether that was good or bad news. Part of me felt relief at not having to face Dominic so soon. Another part felt uneasy, uncertain what might change or stay the same without him here. Elena placed a bowl of hot porridge before me, simple yet rich in flavor. I ate slowly, letting the warmth ease the tension of a sleepless night. After breakfast, she led me through the house, showing me each room without concealment. The living room held a wall of books, mostly philosophy and history, along with a few leather-bound journals with no titles. The study on the west side caught light only in the afternoons. A long wooden desk and a worn brown leather chair filled the space. Behind it stretched a corridor that opened to the back patio, where stone tiles framed a wooden bench facing a small pond ringed with reeds. I realized the house had been designed so that whoever lived inside could see nature from every angle, while no one outside could ever look in. An inversion of surveillance, a way to control without confinement. Elena spoke little as we walked, but each time I lingered somewhere, she would share a small fragment. The orchid there blooms at the end of April. The lamp near the bookshelf was a gift from Dominic's mother, who died years ago. The frayed rug by the door was the only thing left from his old apartment in Boston. These fragments, scattered and quiet, began to piece together a blurred image of a man I didn't yet understand but no longer saw as entirely foreign. I spent most of the day at the writing desk in my room, staring at the notebook still untouched since I first saw it. I didn't write, but I thought about everything. About Harrington, about the photograph, about that moment when I pressed the shutter without realizing I had captured something buried deep within a world no one wanted to face. I thought about Dominic, his voice, his distance, the way he cornered my emotions with cold truths that left no room for illusions. I didn't know how long I'd be here, or when this story would end, but one thing I knew for certain. The house was not indifferent. It was holding me, waiting for me to decide whether I was a guest, a captive, or a witness stepping into a truth far larger than anything I had ever believed was real. On the third morning in Asheville, I found a handwritten letter slipped under my door. There was no envelope, just a folded sheet of paper in sharp, precise handwriting, completely unfamiliar. Dominic still hadn't returned. I knew that wasn't a coincidence. His absence felt deliberate, like a space carved out to force me to think, to look directly at everything I'd only dared to glance at before. The letter had no greeting, no signature, only 2 short paragraphs. By the time you read this, I may be hundreds of miles away, or just a few walls apart. Distance doesn't matter as much as this. The photograph isn't just evidence, it's a key. The question is no longer whether you'll keep it, but what you're willing to sacrifice to keep silent. I read it again and again, feeling a sharp ache at my back, that old reflex of survival that had never left me since Chicago. Holding the paper, I went downstairs, where Elena was watering plants in the glass room. She saw me and didn't seem surprised when I held up the letter. "Who sent this?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. Elena set down the watering can, wiped her hands on her worn apron, and looked me straight in the eye. "You're not imprisoned here, Grace, but freedom has a price. Dominic hoped you'd understand that on your own." "What does that mean?" I tightened my grip on the letter. "That I'm supposed to stay quiet? That the truth dies so I can keep breathing?" She neither nodded nor shook her head. "Some truths, when revealed, don't free anyone. They only kill the weakest first." I turned away, unwilling to let her see my eyes burn red. "I'm not weak. I wasn't born to be silenced by stronger people." Elena stepped closer, her tone softer than I expected. "I know, but courage isn't always about shouting. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stay silent to stay alive." I left the glass room and walked straight into the backyard, where the small pond lay still among the trees. The surface was flat as glass, but underneath, something was shifting. I sat on the bench, feeling every beat of my heart strike against my ribs like a drum of warning. I thought of the last time I spoke with Harrington, how he avoided my eyes when I asked about an investigation suddenly shut down. He had been afraid. Not of the courts, not of the press, but of the ones whose names were never written down. Dominic returned late in the afternoon. I heard the car before it reached the end of the forest road. He entered the house wearing a long coat covered in dust, his face tired but his eyes as sharply aware as ever. I didn't wait for him to rest. I held the letter in front of him the moment he stepped inside. "Did you write this?" Dominic glanced at it briefly, then nodded. I wanted you to think without me around. You needed to understand that this isn't coercion. It's choice. An agreement. An agreement? I scoffed. Between me and who? The person who killed Harrington? Or you, the man keeping me as his backup piece on the board? Dominic hung his coat and sat across from me in the living room. Between you and reality. I don't need your complicity. I need your survival. There's a list of people who saw what you saw. None of them are alive to tell it. My throat tightened. So what do you want from me? To stay silent forever? To bury everything? Dominic didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside is an encrypted USB drive, the only copy of the photos you took. You can keep it or destroy it. No one else knows it exists. No backups, no servers, no cloud, only you. I stared at the envelope as if it were a ticking bomb. So this is the price of silence? A chance to disappear as long as I never open my mouth again? Dominic nodded. You don't have to sign anything. You only have to choose. I stood, my thoughts tangled into knots. Since the day I entered journalism, I'd believed in light that truth was the only force that couldn't be bought. But now I was standing before a choice no textbook or code of ethics had prepared me for. Keep the truth and lose my life, or give it up and survive another day. And that was something no one ever taught me in the pursuit of justice, that sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the price of staying alive. I didn't open the envelope that night. I left it on the table, staring at it as if by looking long enough, I might somehow understand what I was meant to do. But no message rose from the paper. No divine instinct came to guide me. Only the silence of the house and the wind threading through the pines outside, whispering meanings I couldn't decipher from a world I had never been allowed to enter. The next morning, Dominic led me into a room he had never mentioned before. The door was at the end of the ground floor hallway, hidden behind a silver-gray abstract painting that had to be pushed aside to reveal its real hinges. The room lay entirely underground, no windows, no natural light, illuminated only by recessed lights casting a soft, museum-white glow. But what made me go still wasn't the room itself. It was what hung on the walls. Photographs, portraits, black and white, faces. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Harrington was among them. A photograph of him during a hearing, his eyes tense and distant, chin slightly raised, as though trying to preserve the last fragment of dignity before he bowed his head. The next image was of a state politician I had heard of, who'd retired quietly after a financial scandal no one had ever traced. Then, a journalist once accused of fabricating information, a member of the Justice Department who had been abruptly reassigned without explanation, and countless others. All those faces, through Dominic's lens, no longer represented power or truth. They were people balanced on the edge where light and shadow met. I turned to him, a chill running down my spine. What is this? Dominic stepped closer, his fingertips brushing the wooden frame of one photo. People who once stood between two choices. Some chose survival, some chose truth. Not everyone got a second chance to choose. I turned back toward the wall. Why keep these? Aren't you the one who's supposed to clean everything up? I don't keep them to threaten, he said. I keep them to remember that everything I do has consequences, that not everyone is just a pawn. Some were friends, some were enemies, but they all shared one thing. They came closer to the truth than they were ever allowed to. Dominic handed me a small photograph, not framed, still sealed in its plastic sleeve. I recognized it instantly, the shot I had taken of Harrington and Takashi Saito on the corner of Grand and 17th. But this one was wider. I didn't remember framing it that way. And at the edge of the image, barely visible, was another figure, Dominic. I looked at him, my eyes wide. You were there. He nodded. I wasn't outside of it. I just never chose a side. Why did you let me take the picture then? Dominic studied me for a long time. Because I needed to know if you'd see something beyond the image. Some only see a conversation. Others see a transaction. But only those who understand consequence can see the truth. Then, what did I see? I asked. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He placed the photograph back on the table with a care so delicate it felt like he feared it might vanish. You saw what others have spent years trying to bury, that justice is an illusion, shaped by the angle of the lens. And you pressed the shutter the moment that illusion cracked. I stood there, uncertain if it was shock or recognition that held me still. The portraits on the walls stared back, not accusing, not pleading, just existing as silent witnesses. And I knew then that if I didn't choose silence, one day my face might join theirs. Another frame, another name no one would mention, and a story no one would live long enough to tell. I never returned to the portrait room again. Dominic didn't stop me, nor did he mention it. He wasn't the kind of man who forced others to face what they weren't yet ready to accept. But even though I left that room behind, the faces on the walls followed me through every step, every silence that filled the house. They weren't just photographs, they were silent warnings, alternate versions of what my future could become if I took one wrong step. I no longer felt like a journalist, nor a victim. I hovered in between without labels, without a clear identity, a witness forced into silence, someone not free enough to escape, yet not dangerous enough to be erased. During Dominic's absence, I began to write, not to publish, not to send anywhere. I wrote simply to keep a fragment of reality for myself amid all the layers of deceit I had been wrapped in. Each night, after Elena went to sleep and the house sank into stillness, I opened the notebook on my desk and wrote, fragments of memory, unanswered questions, moments when it felt like the world itself was cracking open. I didn't call it a diary. I called it evidence. No one read it. No one knew. But within each stroke of ink, I tried to hold on to what was left of my humanity. One night, as I was writing about the photograph with Harrington, a sudden gust of wind swept through the half-open window. I startled, stood to close it, and noticed a thin envelope slipped under my door. No address, no name, just one short sentence in an unfamiliar hand. Between witness and accomplice lies only a testimony. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten copy of an investigation file from 5 years earlier regarding a disappearance never made public. The missing person was Ellen Park, an investigative reporter who had worked in Detroit. I remembered her, vaguely. She'd written a piece about internal police corruption, and after that her name vanished from every column. The file read, "Investigation suspended due to lack of evidence." No date of disappearance, no scene description, just silence. And now, that silence was in my hands, a reminder that I wasn't the first to walk this path. I carried the envelope downstairs to the living room, where Dominic sat alone with a glass of red wine. He looked at me as if he had known I would come. I placed it before him. "How many have disappeared?" I asked. Dominic didn't pretend not to understand. He met my eyes. "Enough that no one calls it an accident anymore." "And what about you?" I asked. "Are you keeping me here to stop that from happening, or to make sure I don't cause it?" Dominic set down his glass and straightened. "I keep you because you're the first who hasn't disappeared, but that won't last forever. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you need to understand where you stand." "Am I a prisoner?" "No, but you're not free either." "Then what am I?" Dominic paused before answering, his voice low and deliberate. "You're a witness, and sometimes a witness needs to be kept somewhere no one can find, not even themselves." I left the room without another word. His answer wasn't meant to comfort, but neither was it a threat. It was truth, cold and bare as the night air outside the forest. As I climbed the stairs, I realized I was no longer the same Grace I had been. I didn't know who I was becoming, but I knew this much. When you see what no one wants you to see, you don't just lose your old life, you lose yourself. And then you learn to survive in that fragile space between captivity and the kind of silence chosen to stay alive forever. The next morning began with a strange phone call. Elena answered it, and her voice deepened the moment she heard the name on the line. Then she came into my room, her expression heavy, and told me that Dominic wanted me ready. We were leaving Asheville within an hour. I didn't ask where, I just nodded. Questions no longer mattered. I already knew the answers would change nothing about the fact that I had no right to refuse. This trip was different from the last two. No haste, no police tailing us. Just a quieter Dominic, withdrawn and contemplative, and a new driver, tall, stoic, with the kind of patience that looked like it had been worn smooth by time. We left the forest behind, passed through small towns, crossed highways that stretched endlessly northward toward a place I had never imagined going. By late afternoon, the car turned through an iron gate, leading into the grounds of an old university, buried among rustling trees. There were no signs, no students, no faculty, only a 3-story limestone building, its walls veined with moss, its windows dull and opaque as though untouched for years. Dominic led me up to the 2nd floor, where a man was waiting in a room that smelled of old books and older computers. He looked to be around 60, thin, with sharp eyes behind round glasses. His name was Walter Kessler. He was the one who had written the code that had made my skin crawl the first time I examined the metadata on Harrington's photo. Walter didn't shake my hand. He just nodded and gestured to a chair before turning to Dominic. "How much does she know?" Dominic answered simply. "Enough to stay alive, not enough to understand why." Walter turned his gaze to me. "Do you know why the metadata in that image made you a target?" I shook my head. "I thought it was just technical data." Walter laughed, not a laugh of amusement, but of someone tired of hearing the same naive answer repeated. "If metadata were just technical data, I wouldn't have spent the last 3 years hiding. The photo you took contained a numeric code, one that matches an internal transaction control string belonging to an investment fund tied to one of 3 financial entities connected to the Japanese government." My stomach tightened. "So you're saying the photo didn't just capture Harrington and Takashi, it contained financial evidence?" Walter nodded. "Not just evidence. A breach, a leak in the system. The danger isn't in the picture, it's in what travels with it." Dominic stepped toward the desk, opened an old laptop, and pulled a USB from his pocket. He inserted it, and lines of data filled the screen. Symbols, digits, a web of connections ending at a name I didn't recognize. Walter pointed at it. "That's the man behind the network. A programmer, a genius, hired to bury money through layers of shell companies and anonymous accounts. No one knows his face, but I do, because he was my student." I leaned back in the chair, breath uneven. "And his link to Harrington?" Dominic answered for him. "Harrington was the receiver one of the officials paid to look the other way. Takashi was just the courier, the messenger, but the architect, the one who hid the money, was him." Walter nodded. "And if that metadata ever surfaces, he'll have to come out to erase it. He'll have to clean the trail. And you're the last person holding the fragment that ties it all together." I stared at the screen. To anyone else, it would look like random numbers, meaningless code. But those numbers had turned me into prey chased, silenced, uprooted from a Chicago apartment and dragged here, to this forgotten building, to sit across from 2 men I barely knew while hearing about people who died because of digits. Walter rose, pulled a thin folder from behind the desk, and placed it in front of me. "If you sign this, I'll transfer all the data to a secure drive only you can access. You can keep it, or destroy it. But after today, no one will ever reach it again, not even me." Dominic's eyes met mine, not urging, not yielding. "This decision isn't about truth anymore," he said quietly. "It's about survival." I looked down at the contract before me. The ink was dry, the pen was ready, and I, once just a witness, was now being asked to become the keeper of the final gate to a network that had killed more people than the truth could ever save. I didn't sign, not because I was sure it was the right thing to do, but because my hand simply wouldn't move. Dominic and Walter didn't press me. They just watched, as if they had already anticipated my hesitation, as if my indecision was an essential part of the process itself. I left that cold stone room long after night had fallen, the wind outside the hallways whispering like the voices of those who had once entered and never found their way back out. On the drive home, Dominic said nothing. He let me sit alone in the back seat, while questions spun through my head like a storm with no eye. I thought about the name hidden in the code, the prodigal student, the man who moved money like he was sketching a labyrinth inside the real world. I thought about Harrington, the despair in his eyes in that photograph, a man who had gone too deep and had no road left to return. But more than that, I thought about myself, a woman too powerless to change the world, yet not naive enough to believe that truth alone would save it. I had written hundreds of stories. Some made noise, some vanished like stones sinking into a lake. But none had ever cost me my identity, my freedom, the way that photograph had. That night, I wrote again, not in the notebook this time, but on loose pages, one by one, folded carefully and never sent. I wrote as if speaking to those who would never read them. A letter to my mother, who once told me that silence is a kind of betrayal. "I'm sorry, Mom. I tried to speak. I tried to live the way you taught me. But this time, if I speak, I might not live to see another day." A letter to Harrington, the man I had doubted, resented, and finally pitied. "I wish you had trusted me enough to show me the truth before it was too late. I wish I had understood your eyes that last time we met. Maybe I could have saved you, or at least preserved some fragment of you that didn't vanish beneath layers of dust and reports." A letter to myself, Grace, from years ago, who still believed a camera could change the world. You wouldn't like who I've become, I know. But if you were here, if you saw what I've seen, I hope you'd understand that survival is not failure. It's a choice, and it's the hardest one of all. I placed those letters in a small tin box, locked it, and hid it deep in the drawer of my room in Asheville. Dominic didn't ask. Elena didn't notice, but I knew that if I were ever gone, someone would find it. And maybe, just maybe, they would read those words and know that I tried. The next morning, I carried the envelope containing the data back to Dominic's study. He was sitting there, reading the news, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. I set it on his desk. He didn't ask. I just said, "I'll keep it, but I won't send it to anyone." Dominic nodded, barely, but enough. He understood, and perhaps that was what he had wanted all along. No oaths, no signatures, just someone still clear-headed enough to know what to keep and what to let go. On my way back to my room, I passed a hallway where an untitled oil painting hung a woman standing with her back to the viewer, facing the sea, her hair swept forward by the wind. I stopped for a long time, seeing myself in her shape, someone who hadn't turned away, but had never truly left. And I realized some stories aren't meant to be told aloud. They exist in the letters never sent, in the truths we choose to keep in silence, and in the strangest kind of courage, to keep living, even when no one knows you once stood in the storm of a buried truth. Elena's kitchen was the only place in that house untouched by the feeling of vigilance and silence. Every morning, when I woke and went downstairs, the air was already filled with the scent of hand-roasted coffee, of toast spread with cinnamon butter and homemade honey, of herbs whose names I could never seem to pronounce correctly. Elena never asked whether I had slept, never spoke of Dominic, or of the letters I hid, or of the drive I kept. She behaved as though my life here were something already accepted, and that the only duty left was to make each day pass evenly, neither too light to drift away, nor too heavy to collapse under. I began helping her in the kitchen, wiping counters, chopping vegetables, kneading dough now and then. No one asked me to. I didn't think I was trying to belong. Maybe I just needed something for my hands to do, something to keep my mind from circling back to numbers, to photographs, to choices no one had ever taught me how to make right. Elena cooked without recipes. She felt every ingredient, every shift in temperature, every unspoken rhythm of time. I once asked her why she never used timers or scales. She only smiled and said some things, when measured too precisely, lose their soul. I didn't understand then, but gradually I saw it in everything she did, in the way she broke a sprig of rosemary, the way she tested the broth with just her lips, the faint smile that crossed her face whenever she spoke of a past no one could tell was real or imagined. Once I asked when she had met Dominic. She paused, wiped her knife with a clean cloth, and said, when he still couldn't hold a glass of water steady without trembling. Her answer kept me quiet for the rest of the afternoon. I had never imagined Dominic as a child. In my mind he existed as a fixed force in this world, a strange gravity between life and death, between truth and deception, between justice and shadow. But in this kitchen, under the soft yellow light and the rhythmic sound of a knife against the cutting board, he suddenly became someone who had once been broken, someone who had grown up in a world without choices, and when given the chance, built an entire universe of control to make sure nothing could ever hurt him again. Dominic never joined us for breakfast. He usually appeared in the afternoons, sometimes after hours of phone calls, sometimes after trips to nowhere he ever named. He moved through the kitchen like a stranger in his own house, never touching the food, only pouring a glass of water or coffee before disappearing behind the door to his study. I once asked Elena if he ever cooked. She said he used to before the world forced him to choose between keeping the fire in the kitchen or keeping it in his heart for something else. Dominic chose the latter, and from then on, the kitchen became merely a place to pass through. One afternoon, while Dominic was away, I took the small tin box that held my unsent letters and brought it down to the kitchen. I didn't read them again. I just placed the box inside a cupboard near the oven, where I knew Elena would one day find it. When she asked why, I said softly, "Because I need someone to remember the things I'm afraid I might forget." She didn't reply. She simply laid her hand on my shoulder, warm as the breath of the stove. And in that moment, I realized that in a world of wrong choices and buried secrets, there were still things that didn't need explaining, rewriting, or encrypting. They were the rare, genuine fragments of being where a person could still find what was left of themselves in a kitchen, in a shared glance of understanding, and in the scent of bread that hadn't yet cooled. Dominic spoke to me about Detroit one late afternoon, while I was helping Elena arrange jars of freshly made strawberry jam on the shelves. He stood by the doorway, soundless, as if he only appeared when the kitchen had grown quiet enough to absorb something heavier than a recipe. He told me to prepare, because the next morning we would leave Asheville. Not to run, but to meet someone. Someone who had once been a link in the chain of transactions encoded within the metadata of the photograph I had taken, and who now wanted to speak directly, with no intermediaries, no encryption, no hidden messages. I didn't ask why now, or why me. I just looked at Dominic and asked if he was sure. He said he wasn't sure of anything, but sometimes people only come forward when they know they're talking to the last person capable of keeping their word. We left Asheville at night, crossing hills draped in fog and dim amber light. Dominic didn't explain much, only that the man we were going to meet had once been part of the system but had withdrawn after a failed transfer nearly exposed the entire network. He had been a security engineer for a Tokyo-based conglomerate, but grew up in New Jersey, 2 citizenships, 2 value systems, and a loyalty that belonged to neither. The drive lasted nearly 10 hours, with no overnight stops, no lingering anywhere. Dominic received an encrypted message at dawn, and after that, we turned off the highway into the heart of old Detroit, where abandoned factories stood beside refurbished buildings, turned into studios or hipster cafes. The car stopped before a warehouse converted into a shared workspace. From the outside, it looked derelict, but inside, the lighting and security systems revealed it was still very much in use and meticulously maintained. The man waiting for us was named Marlon Ishida, somewhere between 40 and 50, slight, close, cropped hair, eyes sharp and restless, like someone who always thought faster than he could speak. He didn't shake hands. He just nodded and led us through a narrow corridor into a sealed room with only 1 table, 3 chairs, and a dark computer screen. Dominic sat first, silent. I followed, my hands unconsciously tightening in my lap. Marlon studied me for a long time before speaking. He said the photograph I had taken wasn't just a system glitch. It was a fracture in the very principle of untraceability they had once believed unbreakable. The metadata contained not only transaction codes but also the coordinates of an intermediary server used in a transfer sequence that had supposedly been closed 3 years ago. Its reappearance meant someone still had level 3 access, something theoretically impossible unless there was an insider, or someone who had never truly left. Marlon didn't say which side he was on, but from his eyes, I could tell he wasn't entirely out of it either. I asked why he contacted us. He said he wanted to know what I planned to do with the code. Dominic looked at me, waiting. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked another question. What would happen if I published it? Marlon exhaled deeply. At least 4 countries would have to reopen investigations into covert financial networks tied to regional security policy. More than a dozen deaths would no longer be classified as accidents, and millions in foreign aid would freeze overnight. I nodded. And if I stay silent? Marlon held my gaze for a long moment, then said, "Then you live. And in this game, that's the best choice anyone can hope for." Dominic said nothing after that meeting. On the drive back through Detroit's cold streets, I watched ruin and renewal coexist side by side, like 2 faces of the same coin. I understood then that things as vast as truth never come without a cost, and perhaps survival staying alive to remember was its own form of action, a kind of testimony that no one could silence, not with money, not with code, but with the quiet endurance of existing in the dark and still refusing to vanish. We left Detroit just as the first light touched the windshield, the sky a muted gray like a curtain waiting to rise on something not yet formed. Dominic said nothing on the drive out of the city. I stayed silent too, not because there was nothing to say, but because inside me, the questions had tangled into a knot with no clear end. Marlon's words echoed in my mind, rhythmic and hollow like the sound inside an empty room. If you publish, the dead will have names. If you stay silent, you will live. But what if I chose neither? What if I simply erased myself from the equation altogether, walked away as if I had never entered it at all? When we stopped at a small roadside gas station, Dominic turned to me the first time he'd really looked at me that day. He asked if I wanted to disappear, not hide, not change my name, but erase my existence completely from every database, every registry, every trace of public record, a disappearance with no aftershock. I stared at him, uncertain if it was an offer or a test. Dominic said it could be arranged. He knew someone who could do it not through violence or forgery, but through consent, through the quiet cooperation of those who wrote and rewrote the original records. People who understood that a name erased from existence could not be investigated, interrogated, or exploited. He called it negotiated erasure. I gave a faint laugh. It sounded like something out of a spy novel. But Dominic didn't laugh. He said it was the last thing he could give me. A way out that didn't require betraying anyone, not even myself. I said nothing. For months I had believed there were only two choices: speak and die, or stay silent and live in fear. But now Dominic was laying a third path before me. Not to live haunted, but to live untraceable. A strange freedom, cold, almost cruel. We arrived at a wooden cabin by the edge of a lake, where Dominic said we'd meet the man who could make it happen. His name was Caleb, around 50, dressed plainly like a retired schoolteacher, but his way of speaking carried the weight of someone who had once moved in circles most people only read about in classified files. He didn't ask many questions. He listened to Dominic's explanation, then turned to me and asked one, "Are you sure?" I nodded. Nothing in his expression changed. No surprise, no pity, only the quiet acceptance of a man accustomed to erasing people from the map of the world with legal precision. Caleb handed me 3 dossiers, each one a different life I could choose to step into. One was in Canada, under a new name, with a job in environmental research. One in southern Italy, at a monastery-turned-art center. And one in Oregon, as a library manager in a small town where no one cared too much about anyone's past. I chose Oregon, not because it was the safest, but because it was the only one that felt breathable, a place where trees and books might soothe the parts of me I could never tell another soul about. After I signed the declaration forfeiting all rights tied to my real name, Caleb gathered the papers. He would erase every trace within 12 hours. Once I left, there would be no more record of Grace Whitmore. Dominic didn't congratulate me, didn't say goodbye. He just looked at me one last time and said, "Sometimes surviving isn't about running. It's about accepting that you can't fix everything, but you can still go on." I didn't hug him. We didn't shake hands. Between us, there were already too many things without names. When I climbed into the new car, with new documents, a new face, heading toward a place where no one would know who I was, I felt no regret, no fear, only lightness, a strange, weightless clarity, as if for the first time in my life, I was allowed to stand outside the story I had once lived in. And I knew then that sometimes disappearing isn't surrender. It's the only way to protect what's left of the truth from being bent one more time. The last city I entered as Grace Whitmore was Portland, on an early autumn morning, when dew still clung to the windshield and the streetlights blurred into shallow puddles left by the night's rain. From there, I would travel south to a small town called Rainsfield, where an old wooden library sat at the intersection of 2 quiet main streets, with no traffic lights to direct anyone. In the dossier Caleb had given me, I was Anna Caldwell, 37 years old, formerly employed by a nonprofit education foundation in Iowa, now moving to Oregon to start over after a period of burnout and family loss. I didn't need to memorize the story. It was written just real enough to keep me from lying too much, yet vague enough that no one could dig too deep. The train ticket to Rainsfield bore my new name one way. Economy class, non-refundable, a true ticket out. Dominic never contacted me again. I didn't expect him to, and I didn't want him to. Seeing his name on a screen would only remind me of the moments when I had been forced to choose between survival and integrity. I didn't hate him. If anything, I owed him. But debts in his world are not meant to be repaid, they're meant to be remembered and locked away in a place only you can open. I arrived in Rainsfield in the late afternoon. The bus stopped near a small fishing supply store. The sky was dull, as if preparing to rain, yet it never did. A weather of hesitation like the feeling inside me. The woman who met me was the head librarian, her hair almost entirely silver, her eyes sharp and cautious, the way only those who've lived long enough can tell who's passing through and who intends to stay. She showed me through the rows of shelves, pointed out where the records were kept, introduced the staff with brisk nods, and handed me the key to a small room behind the library where I'd stay for the first few months. The room was small but clean, with pale blue walls and a window overlooking 2 old maple trees in the courtyard. On the table sat a glass of water and a handwritten note telling me I could use the kitchen if I wanted to cook. No one asked where I came from. No one asked what I was running from. This town seemed used to the quiet of people who had chosen to begin again, and I realized that was exactly what I needed. I spent my first week learning the town's rhythm. Each morning I brewed coffee, opened the library, shelved books, answered small questions about crime novels or children's stories, ate lunch on the garden bench, and returned to the records. No one recognized me as the investigative journalist who once stood between the government and the mafia. No one knew I once held a drive that could bring down an entire financial system. And I had no intention of telling them. Each night, I wrote again, not secret letters this time, but short entries in a new notebook. Not to preserve evidence, but to preserve myself. Once, I dreamed of the house in Asheville, Elena baking bread, Dominic standing at the doorway as always. I asked him if he regretted anything. He didn't answer. He only looked at me and said, "You're still alive. That's enough." I woke drenched in sweat and stepped outside, breathing in the cold night air. There was nothing but wind and damp earth, but I knew the dream wasn't just memory. It was a reminder that the past still lived somewhere, even if I had changed my name, my face, my life. Someday, it might come knocking to reclaim what was left unfinished. But until that day, I would live fully, quietly in this small corner of the world, among people who didn't know who I had been, and didn't need to know to care for who I was now. The escape Dominic had given me wasn't a perfect freedom. It was another beginning, quieter, lonelier, but more honest than any dream I'd ever had about justice. And sometimes, that is enough. I found the first journal in the storage room behind the library on a Saturday morning, while sorting through boxes of old books no one had paid attention to in years. It had no label, no library code, just a dark leather notebook, its corners worn, buried among scraps of paper as if someone had once meant to throw it away but couldn't. When I opened it, I realized the handwriting didn't belong to anyone in this town. It was the kind of script taught under pressure, precise, steady, but restrained, as though each word was a secret forced into silence. I sat on the wooden chair by the window, where the light was just enough to read without turning on the lamp. The first pages were the notes of a woman living under an assumed identity. Much like me, she never gave her name, only the initial times M***. She once worked for an organization she called the Bureau, though it wasn't clear whether it was government or private. The entries weren't linear. Some pages were transcripts of conversations, some were fragments of letters, and most were quiet, searching reflections that felt eerily like the ones I had written myself. The further I read, the more a chill spread through me. There were too many coincidences to dismiss. She had lived in the northern mountains. She had lost her identity. She had carried a hard drive no one could know about. M once wrote that there are 3 kinds of people who choose silence: those who fear, those who've lost faith, and those who know too well the cost of speaking. She never said which she was, but I knew she was all 3. Her words pulled me back to the places I had tried to forget, but they also made me feel less alone. I wasn't the only one who had chosen this path. I wasn't the only one who felt that each day was a test of courage, simply times, not times to act. I was near the end when I heard a knock on the door. My pulse quickened. Old instincts never really fade. It was the head librarian, holding a postcard. No return address, just my new name, *, Anna Caldwell, *, written in an unfamiliar hand. I thanked her, waited until she left, then opened it. Inside, there was only one line. *, do you still have it? *, no signature, no sender, just a photograph printed on the card, a lake framed by pine trees, identical to the one Dominic and I had stopped by before meeting Caleb. I stared at the words, trying to decide whether this was a cruel coincidence or a deliberate signal. No one in town knew my past. Dominic had no way to reach me, not unless he wanted times to leave a trace. I read the question again and again. *, do you still have it? *. It didn't say what it was. The drive? The identity? The trust? The evidence? I slipped the postcard into the journal and locked them both in the drawer of my room. That night, I dreamed I was standing at a fork in the forest, one path leading back to Asheville, one sinking into darkness, and one that vanished into fog. Dominic stood behind me, silent. I asked him where he was going. He said, "It doesn't matter where I go. What matters is whether you still have the strength to keep walking." I woke before dawn, heart pounding, palms damp. I stepped outside and breathed in the cold air. There was nothing but the whisper of wind and the scent of wet earth. And yet, I knew I was still carrying everything I thought I'd left behind. The past hadn't vanished, it had only learned to write in code. And one day, maybe soon, I would have to answer that question. Not with words, but with a choice, a letter unsent, or a step that would once again redefine who I was. I stared at the postcard for days, never opening the drawer, never touching it. Yet in my mind, that single line kept echoing like a voice from somewhere I could no longer ignore. Do you still have it? Such a simple question, harmless on the surface, but to me, it was a key. And once you realize there's a key, you can't sit still forever. I began to dream of the things I had buried. I dreamed of the old camera, of the photograph of Harrington standing beside Takashi, of Dominic with that gaze that saw through everything, yet revealed nothing. I dreamed of the cabin in the woods, where Elena baked apple pies and hid her stories in the scent and the silence. And then, as if it were inevitable, I began to write again, not to remember, but to avoid forgetting who I had been. This time, I didn't hide the notebook under the pillow or in a locked drawer. I left it on the table, beneath the sunlight pouring through the window, as a reminder that I no longer needed to hide. I wrote about the night in Detroit, about the look in Marlon's eyes when he said that truth was something no one truly wanted to see. I wrote about the night Dominic asked me if I wanted to disappear, and how I had nodded without understanding what that choice would really cost. I wrote about the loneliness of survival, a strange privilege no one dares to admit is real. One morning, as I opened the library, a woman was waiting on the steps. She wore a long coat, a knit hat, no makeup. She could have been a schoolteacher late for a parent meeting. But when she looked up, I recognized her eyes. Not because I had seen her before, but because I had once seen that same look in the mirror, the gaze of someone who had crossed the line between life and death, carrying something invisible yet unbearably heavy. She introduced herself as Eleanor. She didn't say why she had come or how she had found me, only that she had once worked with someone named M, the author of the journal I had been keeping. My heartbeat quickened at the mention of that name, and part of me wanted to run, but I didn't. I invited her in, made coffee, and the two of us sat in the reading corner like strangers who had stumbled upon each other at a crossroads of erased lives. Eleanor told me M had vanished 3 years ago, after transferring a large cache of classified files to an international human rights organization. No one knew where she went, only that she left behind a handwritten note. Some truths don't need to be exposed, only preserved. The words were identical to a line from the journal in my possession. I opened the drawer, took out the notebook, and placed it before her. She turned the pages slowly, reverently, as if reading the final testament of someone she had once loved. When she reached the last page, the one where I had hidden the postcard, she stopped. She didn't seem surprised. She said that phrase was how M would ask whether someone still had the courage to keep the flame. Not the flame that burns, but the one that warms in the dark. Then Eleanor asked if I wanted to see Dominic again. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to, and part of me feared that meeting him would force me to confront everything I had chosen to forget. But in the end, I nodded. Not because I wanted to go back, but because I knew that if I didn't, I would carry that question with me forever, and a person who lives with a question is never truly free. Eleanor took my hand, her eyes calm. She didn't promise anything or offer reassurance. She only said that this journey would not resemble the ones before. It wasn't a journey of escape, it was one of return. Not a return to the old world, but to the part of myself I had left scattered among the forests, the fragments of code, the photographs, and the choices no one ever teaches you how to bear without losing yourself. And so, I agreed. I became the one who returned. No longer Grace, not entirely Anna, but someone who carried both within her, the woman who no longer needed to hide behind an old name, yet no longer feared when someone spoke of her past, the woman who had stepped out of the darkness, carrying with her a shard of light small, but enough to see the road ahead. I left Rainsfield on a light, rainy morning. No one saw me off. No one asked why. I left a short resignation note on the librarian's desk, a few lines of thanks and a wish for peace. Nothing tied me to that place, but nothing compelled me to leave either. This time, the journey wasn't orchestrated by anyone else. There was no Dominic on the other end of a phone, no Caleb drawing plans, no invisible hand scripting my life inside sealed equations. Eleanor simply handed me a handwritten address on a yellow creased slip of paper. She said it was where I needed to go, not to find someone I had lost, but to understand who I might become if I dared to take one more step. The address led to the outskirts of Seattle, to an old-style building wedged between new apartment complexes forgotten by time but still holding on to the quiet I'd been craving. The apartment was on the second floor, its door painted gray-blue, with a windowsill overlooking a narrow alley where stray cats gathered every afternoon. I knocked 3 times. No answer. But the door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air carried the scent of paper, wood, and coffee gone cold. On the table sat a stack of files, a half-finished cup of coffee still warm, and a note that read, "Sit down. I'll be back in 10 minutes." I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I recognized the arrangement: precise, discreet, deliberate. I sat on the sofa, scanning the room. Black and white photographs hung on the walls without frames, some street scenes, some portraits, their faces obscured. In the corner stood a whiteboard covered with equations and fragments of code, the kind that only someone in data security could fully understand. My guess was right. This place was an information hub, but not an official one. No oversight, no management, just people who had stepped out of the system and now sat together, rewriting the rules of a game without a name. When Dominic walked in, I didn't stand. I just looked at him, the same eyes, the same measured gait, but something in him had changed lighter somehow, as if he had finally set down part of the weight no one else could see. He sat across from me without greeting or explanation. We stayed silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "I didn't think you'd come back." I smiled faintly. "Neither did I." Dominic nodded. He reached for the stack of files, flipped through a few pages, then said there had been new disruptions. A portion of the old network had fractured. Marlon was gone. Elena had lost the farm. There were rumors that someone was trying to recover copies of the old data chain to sell to a foreign conglomerate. He didn't say who, but I understood. In this world, nothing is ever truly erased, only buried until someone bold enough digs it back up. Dominic didn't ask me to do anything. He simply said, "If you want, I can give you access to the new system. Triple encrypted, completely isolated from the devices tied to the original metadata. You can observe, or join, or go back to Rainsfield and forget everything." I looked at him, then at the whiteboard behind him. I was no longer a journalist, no longer the keeper of the world's secrets in my pocket. I was just a woman who had crossed the line between right and wrong and returned alive with empty hands, but a heart still beating for something I couldn't yet name. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I finally understood that readiness doesn't come from having enough information. It comes from the moment you decide to move forward anyway. A new address, a new equation, and this time, I wasn't standing on the sidelines. On my first morning in Seattle after gaining access to the new system, I woke earlier than usual. The sky was still gray, the rain more like mist than water. The only sounds were the wind, the soft drip of the coffee maker in the kitchen, and the faint rhythm of keystrokes from the next room where Dominic worked. I sat by the window, watching droplets trail down the glass, wondering if somewhere in another city, someone else was staring at the same lines of code, facing the same invisible threats, and feeling that every decision they made was an ethical test without a correct answer. Dominic hadn't given me a task. He had simply left a stack of encrypted documents, annotated in his tight, deliberate handwriting short, without clear directions, as if he already knew I would know what to do. This data wasn't about money anymore, no transfer records, no offshore accounts. What I saw were personnel files from a network of researchers forced to work under government contracts for projects that never made it to the press. Unknown names, locations that didn't exist on commercial maps, analyses of behavioral patterns, psychological modeling, even charts measuring how leaked truths could shape collective perception. It made my skin crawl. This was no longer a game of power between factions. It was a quiet war over who could manipulate consensus itself. Dominic said he'd stumbled upon this section when a root code failed to respond normally. It led him to a back door, something that should have been deleted years ago. But someone had kept it, deliberately, not to restore, but to control from the outside. I asked if he knew who. He didn't answer, only said the person knew us. Knew times me asterisk. Every time I logged in, I couldn't help but remember Eleanor's words that this was a journey of return. Maybe she'd known I wouldn't stop at simply reading data. Maybe she'd been the one who opened the path. One night, I took out the old postcard again. Asterisk. Do you still have it? Asterisk. I thought about it for a long time. It wasn't about holding data, or silence, or identity anymore. It was about holding on to the one thing that still separated me from those I once fought against. I had no authority, no weapon, no shield of an institution. But I could still see what others chose to overlook. And perhaps more importantly, I was still lucid enough to breathe between the rules. Not follow them, not break them, just live in the space between. Dominic began to speak more not about missions, but about what he'd lost. Once, He told me that at 21, he'd wanted to give everything up and become a musician because music didn't need encryption. But when his cousin was killed in a dockside purge in New Jersey, he learned that some melodies would never drown out the sound of gunfire. I listened, never interrupting, only remembering. Men like Dominic rarely speak of themselves. And when they do, it isn't to share, it's to remind themselves they once had another life, one not built entirely in shadow. I began writing again, not to record or prepare, but to understand that beneath all these systems pressing down on the world, there are still small spaces left for humanity, places where honesty, choice, and even failure can coexist. One afternoon, Dominic took me to the park near Lake Union. It wasn't raining, but it was cold, and the wind carried sounds that felt like fragments of memory. We sat side by side in silence. He handed me a small piece of paper. On it were 3 lines of code, a link, an access key, and a warning times. If you open this, everything changes. Asterisk, I took the paper without asking anything more, because I knew that the moment I accepted it, I had already chosen. Not a side, but a way of being to keep breathing between the rules, between right and wrong, between everything no one ever teaches you how to face. And I understood then that sometimes the bravest act isn't to fight or to rebel, it's to stay alive with clarity, in a world where even the lines of truth have blurred beyond recognition. That morning, the sky was an uncanny shade of blue. The lake was still, a vast mirror reflecting every slow drifting cloud above it. I wore the red coat I'd found in a thrift shop a few weeks earlier, a color so bright it felt almost at odds with the quietness I'd carried all this time. Yet something in that red made me feel alive again, as if I was no longer just surviving but time's existing. Asterisk. Dominic had left at dawn. No drawn-out farewell, no heavy instructions, only a small note that read, Asterisk. Every ending is merely a preparation for a new beginning if you're brave enough to see it that way. Asterisk. I carried the code he'd given me, sat by the lake, and opened it on the old laptop that had long been cut off from every network trace. The code didn't lead to state secrets or anything that could destabilize governments. It led to a series of confessions written by people like me, people who had chosen silence to protect others, people who had lost their bearings in a world built on manipulation, people who had walked the gray space between right and wrong, yet still refused to lose themselves. I read every line, without trembling, without tears. What I felt instead was clear and steady. I wasn't alone. Asterisk. We times weren't alone. The red coat had once belonged to a woman mentioned in a note dated 1999. She had vanished from every system, leaving behind only one trace, a photograph of herself standing by a lake, wearing a red coat, smiling in a way no algorithm could decode. Perhaps she had found peace, and now, I thought, maybe I was moving toward that too. Not because I had fixed anything, but because I had reached the end of my choices and still kept my heart intact. The story I tell you today isn't meant to thrill you, nor to carve out a hero's image. It's simply a human journey of losing one's way, in a world of endless rules and contradictions, yet still finding a sliver of space to breathe, to love, and to exist with compassion. Maybe you're hearing this from a small room, on your way to work, or in the middle of your own difficult decisions. I hope this story stirs something in you, even for just a quiet moment that makes you ask yourself, Asterisk, am I living true to who I am? Am I still keeping the best parts of myself in a world that never stops shifting? Asterisk. And if you've ever felt lost, ever wondered whether anyone could understand the things you hold inside your heart, remember, you are not alone. The truth doesn't always need to be shouted. Sometimes, it only needs to be understood by someone to keep on living. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this story touched something within you, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share it so we can continue bringing more heartfelt and human stories to this community. Tell us how this story made you feel. Did it remind you of something from your own life? Was there a moment that made you see yourself in it? We'd love to read what's in your heart. Goodbye for now, and until our next video, may you stay healthy, peaceful, and gentle with yourself each day. Farewell, and see you soon.